Perfect. Oh, fantastic. And I had actually spent much of my undergraduate career learning about Darwin, learning about the Galapagos, and really being curious about life. And most biologists certainly learn about Darwin, and then it's on the list, the bucket list of places you've just got to go and visit as a scientist. And so I spent a good amount of time trying to work to I've got to get to the Galapagos. And as my first, as Aaron had mentioned, I started off at the University of Massachusetts studying fungal diseases on a different archipelago than the Galapagos out in the Caribbean, and spent a good number of summers when I was in Massachusetts, when it was still winter, when they did have snow, going down to the islands to work on these different interesting fungi, and saw a lot of different birds and creatures. Did a little PhD out in Yellowstone. It was interesting. It was great. Some interesting microbiology. It was not the ocean. I really did like the ocean. So we got back for the postdoctoral research, working with the Hawaiian bobtail squid, this tiny little tiny squid that has a bioluminescent symbiont. So when it goes hunting at night, it can illuminate and essentially counter-illuminate and erase the shadows that it casts underneath. And so this interest in life and organisms, and always want to see a new environment, not necessarily travel. It seems like I'm really just trying to get flip-flops and hit the beach, per se, and there's always some good choices to be made in finding your research projects there. Currently I'm working with a number of different sea turtles out in Long Island at the New York Marine Rescue Center. Is that me? Take it off? Is that better? Okay, great. So at the New York Marine Rescue Center, where there's stranded turtles during the winter, when the ocean levels get cool and the turtles haven't migrated, the turtles need to be rescued. And I'm currently working on some molecular projects trying to identify the sex of these turtles that really you can't tell just by looking at them from small samples of blood. But anyhow, let's get on to a little bit about the Galapagos, and I'm hoping that in this next 5 to 10 minutes here, I can tie in some of the interesting things that I think are brought out and things that I really enjoyed in my trip to the Galapagos. And I don't think that you can really get around talking about the Galapagos or really looking at the Galapagos as a scientist, certainly without mentioning Darwin. And Darwin had, as many of you may certainly well know, Darwin had this 5-year voyage after essentially going to med school, going to theology school, and still not quite sure what was going to happen in life, still trying to discover himself or what the path that he wanted to take. So this unpaid journey for 5 years, for which one of the stops, 36 days, just happened to be in the Galapagos. And when you look at the sheer amount of animals and plants and fossils, specimens that were collected by Darwin, I like to use the analogy, I don't know if you ever, there used to be this television show where I think contestants were given a shopping cart, and they had like 2 minutes to go through a grocery store and shove as many things as they could and get out across the finish line in that time. And otherwise, if they didn't get to keep anything. And that's pretty much, to a degree, what Darwin was doing during these journeys, during this voyage as a naturalist and companion to Fitzroy, the captain. And many of these specimens were collected. Some were marked well, some were not so well. But the sheer volume was extraordinary, being packed together and organized on this ship. And if we take a look at the Galapagos here, you can see just off the coast of Ecuador, we've got this small this island change here. The oldest islands are right over here on the eastern side, San Cristobal, about 4 million years, to some of the more recent ones that are only 700,000. And this is really young. For anybody that's taken a geology class, that's nothing. I think in my microbiology class, when we talk about early origin of life, and we talk about stromatolites, and we talk about things in the 3.8, 3.6 billion years old. Those are old rocks. Those are ones that haven't been subducted by plate tectonics. And so these are recent. This is new. And this is one of the things that made the Galapagos such an interesting area and such a sort of a perfect experiment for a scientist. And a scientist such as Darwin in his with his level of training, with his ideas, that just made it perfect fruit for this discovery of the theory of evolution and natural selection. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. Upon arriving in the Galapagos, his first day, some of the organisms and creatures that Darwin saw, these marine iguanas that when I first got there, it was actually 20 years ago. I actually didn't do research there. I actually went to a conference similar to in the movie. I'm not giving away too much about the movie here. But I was there for just 7 days. Actually, it corresponds to the amount of time I think this story takes place. I'll stop while I'm ahead here. But I remember looking out onto the beaches and seeing these extraordinary sandy and gray stones, and then they would move. And you're like, oh wait, those are the marine iguanas, and you'd be looking for. I expected, and I was almost disappointed a bit in arriving at the Galapagos. There was so much hype about it. I was expecting a little bit more of sort of the biodiversity of a rainforest and such, and it wasn't. It was very stark. It was arid. It was dry. There were not extraordinary flowers, and part of that makes for sort of the magic of evolution, or looking at this speciation on the island that Darwin picked up on and that he remarked in his notebook. A number of other notable species or organisms that were just very easy to identify, the different tortoises, the ranges of them with the changed shapes of their bowed backs, and ones that had much longer necks that had to reach the vegetation of the trees and shrubs that were a little taller. One of my absolute loves were the blue-footed boobies. Dr. Steiner is a huge birder, and I had to put in a few birds here, but the number of sort of not flightless birds, but birds that would just lay their eggs on the ground, and they're very susceptible to predation. One of the issues with cats and other feral animals that quickly go through and decimate some of these populations. And not to name every image here, but certainly the finches. My wife told me I could talk about one of these. She said, these people, these good folks are coming to a movie. I know you're excited about evolution. Tell a few stories, but let them watch their show. Don't get too excited. But I want to talk a little bit about the finches, which I think they do get a lot of play within diversity. But I also, during my trip when I was there about 20 years ago, I got to interact with some of the scientists, Peter and Rosemary Grant, that were present at this particular conference. Okay, Darwin did a good bit of collecting, and having put so many things into his shopping basket and checked them out, it wasn't until almost about a year after returning home, going through his notes, probably missing these beautiful areas there, and looking at a number of these specimens. Many of them were farmed out to other scientists. Darwin did not go through and characterize and name all of the different creatures and rocks and fossils. They were certainly given away. Some, yes. Named a little shrub, shrub after the captain, Fitzroy, because of his opinions of him. It was not a high and mighty tree. It was just a little lowly shrub. And looking at the sort of the beaks of the finches, and looking at the different organisms, or the different shapes and morphology, there were certain inferences that were made about how these organisms lived, how did they survive in these stark environments. And one of the first, just shortly about a year after his return home, in reviewing these notes and looking into some of these different organisms, he made one of the first, in his notes, this little tree that looks sort of like this branch of life, this little bit of a phylogeny, to show how these different speciation, these different species could exist. There were no intermediate forms of these. There were distinct ones. And in this subnote, or at the top there, I think you can read this in handwriting. It says, "I think." And it's sort of this idea of trying to grasp that different species could involve, that there's different branches. And then in the not so easy to read portion, I could lie to you here. Actually, the story, history of lying and telling the truth and naming things is a really big theme in this movie. But here, Darwin discusses to a point and makes the note that many things would have to become extinct if we were going to have these different species and different speciation events. And I think that's such a very true thing. Of all the species that exist, none of them survive. None of them go on and perpetuate. They don't. None of it. You either evolve or you die, and there's no species that are continuous. And so this is an interesting observation early on before Darwin makes his ideas and writes them down. And so these notes here, won't read them completely here, but in looking at these different islands, going from really an island that was 4 million years old, as San Cristobal, one of the first islands, over to the island where this film is filmed, which is only 700,000, you have vast differences of different species and slight nuances in these different animals. And an avid collector collecting these plants and birds would note and notice that these differences, that these different environments, these different pressures, these different foods are going to help shape the organisms and the different species that are present here as well. It was important to note that that these best adapted individuals survive, go on and leave their offspring, passing on their genes. And it's really critical to note that populations of organisms evolve. You don't have just one individual. That you need populations, you need gene flow. And my wife would probably put the flag up and say, "Stop talking about too much biology there. Get to the fun stuff here." And what made the Galapagos such an extraordinary laboratory, this perfect living laboratory? It was really far away from the mainland. You had these 19 different islands that, from 4 million years with the formation of the first one till less than one, anything that got there had to either float in or fly in. It just wasn't going to happen. And so whether there were seeds, there were plants, there were animals, that they had to get there, and they had to start, oftentimes by chance, different currents and what have you. Looking at the different islands, some of these big animals, the finches, distinctly different, and the plants were distinctly different. These ecosystems, these communities that live together here, the food sources, and usually these trophic, or the food components, are these facets of natural selection that limit or shape the individuals. You had, as I criticized, the Galapagos were not this flashy tropical rainforest environment. Because of the fewer species, they were simpler. They was easier to view and to notice these. If Darwin had been visiting a rainforest, they would have just been overwhelmed with birds of different plumage, all sorts of flowers, vines, sounds, creatures that were going on there. There were much, much fewer. And you will see this. I think you'll definitely in the stark environment that you will see. We mentioned that the older and younger islands showed evolution over time, and you would find often one species that would have radiated or diversified that were slightly different on each of these different islands, and that were just far enough to make passage back and forth difficult and not regular. The minimal human impact is really a key one, and it's also one that when I arrived in the Galapagos for my week conference, that I was constantly trying to sneak out of the talks because I wanted to go outside. I wanted to go and see these creatures. I hadn't seen a finch. I was like, I've got to go see a finch here. And but the human impact of the Galapagos at the time was one that was really taken into consideration. There was lots of money. There was funding put towards a lot of the fisheries to stop fishing, to try to transition to tourism, to really conserve and make this sort of a protected area. And it was this recognition of this sort of diversity and this resource, trying to minimize this human impact that was really kind of starting to take hold. And I want to talk briefly about just one small group of scientists. In the short week when I was suffering the meetings, I had my scientific advisor, mentor, Lynn Margulis, was going to speak at this conference, and I had a poster that I was presenting that I was told is still hanging in on one of the walls there. For 20 years, it's got to be pretty shabby in the marine environment. But there were a number of different of scientists that were coming were coming into this conference as well that had been doing work on the Galapagos. And this particular group was Peter and Rosemary Grant. And they had set up on an island north of where the movie is filmed, and it's this very tiny, and you can see a picture of Daphne Major. It is what I would consider it's sort of a lava wasteland, if you will. There's really no tall trees to hide underneath. It is small. There's small shrubs, but it's a perfect refugia for birds, and it was actually a perfect natural laboratory for Peter and Rosemary Grant. At the time, 20 years in, had been sort of the longest running project looking at sort of these Darwin's finches, as they would become named, and how they changed and evolved real time. And so every summer, there was a group of graduate students that would go out and measure the different, the wings, the weight. They'd take a drop of blood, and they would have these little mini calipers to measure the beaks. And I was I was fortunate. I think it was the night before the final talk. My boss was going to give the big talk, and I had to make sure that I was going to be there. And this graduate student said, "Hey, yeah, I'm going to go do some mist netting. I'm thinking I'm going to skip out on the talk." I said, "Oh, I don't know about that." She's like, "Well, have you ever seen any of the finches?" And I said, "Wait, what?" And so I skipped out on my boss's talk, and it wasn't necessarily I knew exactly. I'd given the talk myself, and I knew what was happening, but it was more of a support. You probably shouldn't miss out on your boss's talk. And I think I got called out during the talk. They said, "Oh, I want to thank Andrew." Where's Andrew? Because she always liked to point me out, and I was not there. I was off. And so she assumed it was something about a girl that I hope she was cute. I think she had mentioned to me she was very, always wanted to meddle in my life. And I said, "I was mist netting finches." She says, "Oh, good choice, good choice. You can't leave the Galapagos without doing that." And 20 years later, 40 years, both Peter and Rosemary Grant are still doing this research. It's 40 years of research, essentially looking at these finches that flew in. They really did. They had to. Or they floated in. We don't know. Scientists like to tell stories. They'll tell all sorts of stories. And this is an extraordinary case where this is some of the research trying to show that proves, hey, over 40 years of measurements of these little creatures, on this tiny little island that no one would pick as a research site, and no one's living there. No one's is really trying to put a restaurant on this island either. They're able to capture and to look at these 13 different species of finches that evolved and radiated. And I'm going to just sort of be dramatic here. This is one of the mangrove finches. Aaron, you can tell me if I'm getting these wrong. We've got a little cactus finch, but then we've also got a very narrow-beaked finch that is actually not called the vampire finch, if you would. But these are actually adaptation of essentially sucking blood off from one of the the ground-dwelling nesting birds, the blue-footed boobies here as well. And so being able to change and adapt to utilize the resource to survive, it was definitely happening in here. And from 40 years of research to have one slide, this is absolutely horrible. This is like someone looking on the Cliffs Notes to talk about someone's extraordinary career. But for 40 years, these are real-time observations of climate change, drought affecting bird populations, and this natural selection occurring very rapidly in as few as 3 or 4 different generations occurring. There was a number of different discoveries about speciation, or actually hybridization between different species, and that really confirmed Darwin's theory and really just demonstrated that evolution is observable and measurable in the wild in a very short period of time. One would think, oh, maybe we have to study bacteria that has very rapid generations, but in birds, very, very quickly. So that is really as far as I want to go in terms of talking about the research or my journey or my trip on the Galapagos. It took me some time to get there. I've been thinking about how soon can I take a 5-year-old to the Galapagos, and having marched across the Galapagos, and you'll see from some of the different trails and paths that maybe you want to wait a little bit older, maybe the age of some of the characters that are in the movie. But I really enjoyed it. I think you will enjoy the science that's in this movie, and it's very cinematically beautiful. And if I have any questions for you guys, I'm happy to talk with you after or now, what you will. But thank you so much for letting me present, give you a little window.